It's not that we don't like you, Thomas, my father-in-law, Arthur announced, his voice carrying the bluff, hearty condescension of a man accustomed to being the undisputed patriarch of every room he entered. It's just that, well, let's be frank, son. You're a bit useless. A pleasant enough chap, of course, but utterly without drive, ambition, the killer instinct that a man needs to succeed in this world. We were seated around the ridiculously oversized mahogany dining table in Arthur and Beatrice's opulent suburban home, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. The air was thick with the scent of Beatrice's notoriously overcooked roast beef and the even more suffocating aroma of my in-laws' unshakable sense of their own superiority. My wife, Eleanor, seated beside me, flinched a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one I registered with the practiced eye of a man who has spent 15 years navigating the subtle, treacherous currents of this particular family dynamic. My name is Thomas Finch, 46 years old, and for the past 2 decades, my profession has been, in the eyes of Arthur and the rest of Eleanor's family, a source of quiet, persistent disappointment. I'm a specialist in rare minerals and gemstone analysis, a field that requires a geologist's patience, a chemist's precision, and a historian's appreciation for the slow, silent work of deep time. It is not, however, a profession that lends itself to the kind of flashy, high-stakes corporate maneuvering that Arthur, a retired senior vice president of a mid-tier manufacturing firm, considers the only true measure of a man's worth. Eleanor squeezed my hand under the table, a familiar, silent gesture of apology and support. I offered her a small, reassuring smile in return. I was long past being wounded by Arthur's casual dismissals. His opinion of me, I had long ago concluded, was a reflection of his own narrow, materialistic worldview, not an accurate assessment of my character or my professional achievements. My brother-in-law, Gerald, a man whose own career in middle management was as unremarkable as his golf handicap was high, chimed in with his usual sycophantic enthusiasm. Dad's right, Thomas. You got to be a shark in this world. A killer, not a rock collector. He chuckled, a braying sound that grated on my nerves like cheap industrial diamonds on a cutting wheel. His wife, Cynthia, my wife's sister, offered a smile of pitying agreement, her expression clearly conveying her relief at having married a shark rather than a rock collector. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, ever the concerned matriarch, adopted a tone of gentle, condescending sympathy. Thomas, dear, she said, her voice dripping with insincere concern, it's never too late to find a proper career path. Arthur was just saying the other day, his old firm, Sterling Manufacturing, is always looking for men with potential. Even at the junior level. It would be a start, wouldn't it? Something tangible. Tangible. That was their word for it. My work, which involved identifying the unique spectroscopic signatures of rare earth elements, authenticating the provenance of historical gemstones, and occasionally consulting for major mining corporations on potential new deposits, a process that had, over the years, made me a quiet, but not insignificant fortune, was in their eyes not tangible. It wasn't a corner office, a company car, a title they could easily boast about at their country club. Therefore, it was useless. I took a slow sip of the egregiously overpriced claret Arthur favored, my mind calm, my thoughts already beginning to move with the familiar, patient precision of a geologist examining a complex rock stratum. The layers of their condescension, their dismissiveness, their utter lack of curiosity about my life, my work, my passions, it was all there, a clear, consistent geological record of their character. For years, I had weathered their subtle and not-so-subtle slights with a quiet, almost academic detachment. I had focused on my work, on my love for Eleanor, who, to her immense credit, had always been my staunchest defender, my unwavering ally in this sea of familial mediocrity, and on the quiet, deeply satisfying pursuit of knowledge and discovery in my chosen field. But tonight something shifted. Perhaps it was the public nature of Arthur's pronouncement, the casual cruelty of his useless verdict delivered in front of the entire assembled family. Or perhaps it was the weary resignation I saw in Eleanor's eyes, the pain of having to once again defend her choice of husband, her choice of a life partner who did not conform to her family's narrow, materialistic ideals. A cold, hard resolve began to crystallize within me, a resolve as unyielding as the crystalline structure of the diamonds I so often studied. Arthur, in his arrogant dismissal of my life's work, had made a critical error. He had assumed that my quiet nature was a sign of weakness, my lack of ostentatious ambition a sign of failure. He had no idea of the true nature of my work, of the circles I moved in, of the quiet but significant influence I wielded within my specialized and highly lucrative field. And he certainly had no idea that Sterling Manufacturing, his old firm, the one he still spoke of with a proprietary, almost paternal pride, had recently, and very quietly, become a subject of intense interest from a private equity group I happened to advise on matters of rare earth mineral sourcing for their high-tech manufacturing subsidiaries. The acquisition, I knew from a series of discreet consultations with my solicitor, Alistair Vance, was in its final stages. The private equity group was poised to take a controlling interest, and they were looking for a new chairman for the board, someone with a deep, technical understanding of the raw materials that were now the lifeblood of Sterling's most profitable new product lines. Someone, in fact, exactly like me. I looked across the table at Arthur, at his bluff, self-satisfied face, at the man who had just, with such casual cruelty, declared me useless. He was so proud of his connection to Sterling Manufacturing, so invested in its legacy, so utterly unaware of the tectonic shifts that were about to occur deep within its corporate structure. He believed he was the patriarch, the man of substance, the one who understood the real world. He had no idea that the quiet, unassuming rock collector at his dinner table was, in a very real sense, about to become his boss. Or rather, the ultimate owner of the company that had once defined his entire professional identity. I allowed myself a small, internal smile. The anniversary dinner was indeed about to become a memorable one. Not for Beatrice's overcooked beef or Arthur's pompous pronouncements, but for the quiet, seismic, and deeply ironic recalibration of power that was about to unfold. Arthur had always been a man who understood the bottom line. He was about to receive a rather stark and entirely unexpected lesson in its application. Sometimes the most valuable assets are the ones you can't see, the ones hidden deep beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment and the right expert to bring them to light. And this particular rock collector, I decided, was ready to start drilling. The decision to acquire a controlling interest in Sterling Manufacturing was not, I must confess, initially motivated by a desire for retribution against my overbearing father-in-law. It was a strategic business move, first and foremost, brought to my attention by a consortium of investors I had been advising for several years. This private equity group, led by a sharp, forward-thinking financier named Julian Croft, specialized in identifying and acquiring undervalued manufacturing firms with untapped potential in the high-tech sector. My role as their senior mineralogical consultant was to assess a target company's supply chain, particularly its access to and utilization of rare earth elements, the essential and increasingly scarce ingredients in everything from advanced electronics to green energy technologies. Sterling Manufacturing, Arthur's old stomping ground, had recently, and almost by accident, stumbled into this high-stakes world. They had, a few years prior, acquired a smaller firm that held several key patents on a new type of high-efficiency electric motor, a motor that relied heavily on a consistent supply of neodymium and dysprosium, two of the most sought-after rare earth metals. The current management at Sterling, however, a group of old-school manufacturing veterans who still thought in terms of steel and aluminum, had failed to grasp the profound strategic significance of this acquisition. They were treating their rare earth supply chain as a standard procurement issue, not as the geopolitical and economic chessboard it truly was. They were, in short, leaving a massive amount of value and a significant degree of risk on the table. When Julian Croft and his team had asked me to conduct a discreet due diligence report on Sterling's mineralogical assets and supply chain vulnerabilities, I had initially hesitated. The connection to Arthur was awkward. but my professional curiosity and a sense of fiduciary duty to the investors who trusted my expertise had won out. My report, submitted to Crofts Group 6 months prior, had been unequivocal. Sterling Manufacturing was a diamond in the rough, a company with immense, unrealized potential, but one that was dangerously exposed due to its naive and outdated approach to managing its most critical raw materials. I had identified significant inefficiencies in their sourcing, a lack of long-term supply contracts, and an almost complete absence of any strategy for hedging against the notoriously volatile rare earth market. In essence, Julian, I had summarized in our final presentation, Sterling is sitting on a gold mine, but they're trying to excavate it with a plastic shovel. Under current management, they are one supply chain disruption, one geopolitical tremor, away from a catastrophic production failure. My report had been the final piece of the puzzle for Crofts Group. They saw the opportunity not just to acquire a company, but to transform it, to unlock its true value by implementing a sophisticated, forward-looking resource management strategy. My strategy. The acquisition process had been swift and discreet, conducted through a series of shell corporations and third-party brokers to avoid alerting Sterling's management or their larger competitors until the deal was a fait accompli. The final papers were due to be signed in the coming week, and Julian Croft, a man who valued expertise above all else, had already made it clear that he wanted me to take an active role in the new Sterling's leadership. Thomas, he'd said to me just last week, over lunch at a quiet, exclusive club that Arthur could only dream of getting a membership to, this acquisition is your brainchild. You understand the core value proposition better than anyone. I don't just want you as a consultant. I want you as chairman of the board. I want you to guide the strategic vision, to ensure that Sterling becomes the global leader in high-performance motor technology we both know it can be. The offer was as staggering as it was unexpected. I, Thomas Finch, the quiet rock collector, the useless son-in-law, was being offered the chairmanship of the very company my father-in-law still considered his own personal fiefdom, a company whose name he still dropped with proprietary pride at every opportunity. The irony was so rich, so profound, it was almost overwhelming. I hadn't yet given Julian my final answer. The prospect was daunting. My world was one of quiet labs, of meticulous analysis, of scholarly research. The cut-and-thrust world of corporate boardrooms, of shareholder meetings, of navigating the complex egos of senior executives. It was a world I had always deliberately avoided. But Arthur's words at the anniversary dinner, his casual, public dismissal of my entire life's work, had, I had to admit, tipped the scales. His pronouncement of my uselessness had, paradoxically, ignited a spark of something I hadn't realized was dormant within me. A cold, hard, and deeply satisfying ambition. An ambition not just to succeed on my own terms, but to have that success be so undeniable, so irrefutable, that even a man as willfully blind as Arthur would be forced to acknowledge it. And so, as I sat at that mahogany dining table, enduring the slings and arrows of my in-laws' condescension, a plan began to form in my mind, a plan that went beyond simply accepting Julian Croft's offer. It was a plan for a strategic reveal, a quiet, elegantly executed demonstration of precisely what the useless rock collector was capable of. The first step, I decided, would be a discreet and entirely legal acquisition of information. I needed to understand the current state of Arthur's own relationship with Sterling Manufacturing. He was retired, yes, but he often boasted of his continued influence, his close personal connections on the current board, his role as an informal, elder statesman of the company. Was this true? Or was it merely the nostalgic bluster of a man whose glory days were long behind him? My solicitor, Alastair Vance, a man whose discretion was as impeccable as his legal acumen, was the perfect person to conduct such inquiries. A few quiet calls to his network of corporate insiders, a discreet review of current shareholder registries and board meeting minutes, many of which were, with a little digging, publicly accessible, would likely paint a very clear picture of Arthur's actual versus his perceived influence. The second step would involve a careful calibration of the timing. The acquisition was due to be finalized and publicly announced in a little over a week. The new board, with me as its proposed chairman, would be installed immediately thereafter. I had a small window of opportunity to orchestrate a reveal that would be memorable. And what better venue for such a reveal, I mused, than another Ainsworth family gathering? Perhaps a casual Sunday lunch a week or two from now. A lunch where I would ensure the topic of Sterling manufacturing and Arthur's deep, abiding connection to it would inevitably arise. The final step, of course, would be the presentation of the data itself. Not with anger, not with triumph, but with the cool, factual detachment of a geologist presenting a core sample. A sample that would reveal the true, underlying strata of power and influence. A reality so profoundly at odds with Arthur's carefully constructed self-image that it would, I suspected, trigger a seismic event of truly epic proportions within the fragile ecosystem of his ego. The plan was audacious, perhaps even a little cruel. But then, so too had been Arthur's casual, public dismissal of my life's worth. Sometimes, the most effective way to teach a man who only respects tangible success a lesson in true value is to quietly, methodically, and comprehensively buy his entire world out from under him. The shark, it seemed, was about to be rather comprehensively outmaneuvered by the patient, unassuming rock collector. The week following the anniversary dinner was a blur of quiet, focused activity on my part, a stark contrast to the usual languid pace of my academic and consultative work. Alastair Vance, my solicitor, moved with his customary efficiency, his initial inquiries into Arthur's current standing at Sterling Manufacturing yielding results that were both predictable and, for my purposes, perfect. As I suspected, Thomas, Alastair reported, his voice tinged with a familiar dry amusement. Your father-in-law's perceived influence at Sterling is, shall we say, largely a product of nostalgic self-aggrandizement. He holds a modest, entirely non-voting retirement share package. He has not been formally consulted by the current board on any strategic matter in over 5 years, and his supposed close personal connections on that board seem to consist primarily of exchanging Christmas cards with two gentlemen who, like him, have been retired for the better part of a decade. He is, in legal and corporate terms, a historical artifact, a name in the company's past, not a player in its present or its future. This information was crucial. It confirmed that Arthur's bluster about his continued sway at Sterling was just that, bluster. His entire sense of self-worth, his primary source of patriarchal authority within the family, was built on a foundation of illusion, a carefully curated narrative of past glories and imagined present-day influence. The planned acquisition and my subsequent appointment as chairman would not just be a financial shock to him. It would be an existential one, a direct, public refutation of the very story he had told himself and everyone else for years. While Alastair finalized the last legal details of the acquisition with Julian Croft's team, I turned my attention to orchestrating the denouement. I knew I couldn't simply announce my new position at another stilted family dinner. The reveal needed to be more elegant, more precise. It needed to unfold in a way that would allow Arthur to, in essence, corner himself, to be undone by his own arrogance and dismissiveness. The opportunity presented itself, as it so often does, in the form of my mother-in-law, Beatrice. She called Eleanor a few days later, her voice a mixture of her usual condescending sweetness and a new, almost imperceptible, note of anxious curiosity. After the requisite inquiries about Eleanor's health and a few passive-aggressive comments about the apparent necessity of my continued employment, is poor Thomas still so busy with his rocks and things, dear? One would think at his age he'd be slowing down a bit. She got to the point. Darling, she trilled, your father has just been invited to be the guest of honor at the Sterling Manufacturing annual legacy dinner next Saturday. A very exclusive affair, you know, for past and present company leaders. He's to give the keynote address. Isn't that wonderful? A recognition of his immense contribution to the company's success over the years. My mind raced. The annual legacy dinner. I knew of it, of course. It was a rather stodgy, self-congratulatory event where the old guard of Sterling's management team would gather to reminisce about the good old days and politely ignore the company's declining relevance in the modern manufacturing landscape. It was the perfect stage. He's asked if you and Thomas would care to join us at his table. Beatrice continued, her tone implying that this was an act of immense generosity on their part, an invitation to a world of substance and significance that I, the useless rock collector, was privileged to even glimpse. It might be educational for Thomas, don't you think? To see how a real business operates. Eleanor, who was by now fully, if reluctantly, aware of the impending acquisition and my potential new role, I had briefed her after the anniversary dinner, and her reaction had been a mixture of stunned disbelief, horrified amusement, and a fierce, unwavering support for whatever course of action I chose to take. Handled the invitation with masterful diplomacy. "Oh, Mother, how wonderful for Dad. Of course, we'd be delighted to attend. Thomas would be fascinated." The plan began to form in my mind, its intricate mechanics clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-made chronometer. The acquisition of Sterling Manufacturing by Julian Croft's private equity group was scheduled to be finalized on the Friday before the legacy dinner. The public announcement, however, was slated for the following Monday morning. This created a small, perfect window of opportunity, a weekend where the seismic shift in the company's ownership and leadership would be a known fact to a very small, very select group of insiders, namely Julian Croft, his legal team, Alistair Vance, and me, but entirely unknown to the assembled old guard of the legacy dinner, and most importantly, to Arthur. I called Julian Croft. "Julian," I said, after exchanging the usual pleasantries, "I have a somewhat unconventional request regarding the timing of the announcement of my appointment as chairman." I then laid out my plan. Julian, a man who appreciated not just a good investment, but also a good story, particularly one with a hint of ironic justice, listened with a growing amusement. "Thomas," he'd said, when I had finished, a delighted chuckle in his voice, "that is brilliantly, almost diabolically theatrical. I love it. Consider it done. The announcement will be held until Monday. And I believe," he added, a conspiratorial note in his voice, "that as the incoming majority shareholder, I should probably make a brief, unexpected appearance at this legacy dinner myself, just to pay my respects to the company's history, and perhaps to personally welcome the new chairman to the fold in a suitably public forum." The pieces were all in place. The stage was set. The actors were, mostly unknowingly, about to take their places for the final act of a drama they didn't even know they were in. My role was simple: to sit quietly at Arthur's table, to endure his inevitable condescension, to listen to his keynote address filled with nostalgic self-aggrandizement, and to wait. To wait for the precise moment when Julian Croft, the new, unannounced owner of Sterling Manufacturing, would make his entrance. The useless rock collector was about to preside over a masterclass in corporate geology, a practical demonstration of how quickly and devastatingly the seemingly solid bedrock of an old guard's assumptions can be fractured and displaced by the irresistible, underlying forces of a hostile takeover. The killer instinct Arthur so admired was about to be demonstrated, just not, perhaps, by the shark he was expecting. The grand ballroom of the city's oldest and most prestigious hotel, where the Sterling Manufacturing annual legacy dinner was held, was a symphony in faded grandeur and self-congratulation. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old money, and the collective nostalgia of a generation of executives whose glory days were, like the hotel's slightly threadbare carpets, firmly in the past. Arthur was in his element, holding court at our prominently placed table, accepting the deferential greetings of his old colleagues with a magnanimous, almost regal air. He introduced me to them with a familiar, faintly patronizing tone. "And this is my son-in-law, Thomas Finch, a very bright fellow, in his own, rather academic way. Studies rocks, you know." The men, all of a similar vintage and corporate mindset as Arthur, would offer me a polite but dismissive handshake, their eyes glazing over before they quickly turned their attention back to more important matters, like golf handicaps and the lamentable state of modern politics. I endured it all with a quiet, almost serene, composure, a geologist patiently observing the fossilized remains of a bygone era. Eleanor, beside me, was a masterpiece of supportive diplomacy, her conversations with Beatrice and Cynthia filled with a polite, surface-level engagement that perfectly masked her own, rather acute, anticipation of the evening's impending developments. The dinner itself was a predictable affair. Overcooked prime rib, a series of tedious, self-aggrandizing speeches from various retired vice presidents, and a general atmosphere of comfortable, if somewhat moribund, complacency. Finally, the moment arrived. The master of ceremonies, a florid-faced former marketing director named Bill, rose to the podium. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. A man who is not just a leader at Sterling Manufacturing for over 30 years, but a true titan of industry. A man whose vision and dedication helped build this great company into the powerhouse it is today. Please join me in giving a warm, sterling welcome to our very own Mr. Arthur Ainsworth." A round of polite, if not exactly thunderous, applause filled the room as Arthur, his chest puffed out with pride, made his way to the podium. His speech was exactly what I had anticipated, a rambling, anecdotal journey through the golden age of Sterling Manufacturing, filled with nostalgic recollections of deals closed, competitors vanquished, and the unwavering wisdom of his own management philosophy. He spoke of integrity, of hard work, of this Sterling family, all while conveniently omitting the fact that the company's recent performance had been lackluster at best, its innovation stagnant, its market share slowly eroding. It was a speech from a man looking resolutely backwards, utterly oblivious to the seismic shift that was about to occur right under his feet. He concluded, as I knew he would, with a nod to the future, a future he clearly envisioned as a direct, unchanging continuation of the past. And so, he declared, his voice ringing with misplaced confidence, "As we look to the future, we know that Sterling Manufacturing will continue to be a leader, a beacon of quality and integrity, as long as it holds true to the principles, the values that the Sterling way, that we, the old guard, established. Thank you." He returned to our table amidst another round of polite applause, his face flushed with self-satisfaction. "Well, Thomas," he said, turning to me with a magnanimous, almost pitying smile, "now that's what I call a real business. Substance, history, a legacy, something you can touch and feel. Not like your ephemeral rocks and minerals." And in that precise moment, as if on cue, the ballroom doors at the far end of the room opened. A quiet, almost imperceptible hush fell over the assembled guests as a small group of men, their suits sharper, their demeanors more focused, more predatory than the comfortable old guard of Sterling, entered the room. At their head was Julian Croft, the dynamic, 40-something CEO of the private equity group, a man whose photograph had been in the financial pages often enough to be vaguely recognizable to at least some of the more astute members of the audience. The master of ceremonies, Bill, looked flustered, clearly not anticipating this unscheduled addition to the program. Julian Croft, however, walked directly to the podium with the easy confidence of a man who owns the room, or in this case, the entire company. Bill, after a brief, whispered, and clearly rather one-sided conversation with Croft, scurried away, looking bewildered. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice calm, cool, and carrying an unmistakable aura of absolute authority. "My apologies for the interruption. My name is Julian Croft, and I am the CEO of Croft Capital Partners. I won't take up much of your time this evening, but as of yesterday afternoon, Croft Capital Partners completed its acquisition of a controlling interest in Sterling Manufacturing. I wanted to take this opportunity at this gathering of the company's historical leadership to personally express my deep respect for the legacy you have all built." A collective, stunned gasp went through the room. Arthur, beside me, looked as if he had been physically struck. His face, moments before suffused with pride, went deathly pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "The future of Sterling," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping over the sea of shocked, elderly faces, will be one of innovation, of aggressive growth, of a renewed focus on the high-tech applications of its core technologies. It will require a new kind of leadership, a new strategic vision. And it is for that reason that I am also here tonight to make one other very important announcement. He paused, letting the tension build. His eyes then scanned the room, seeming to search for someone. They came to rest on our table. On me. To guide Sterling Manufacturing into this exciting new era, Julian announced, his voice ringing with a conviction that left no room for doubt. The new board of directors has unanimously appointed a new chairman. A man whose expertise in the critical rare earth mineral supply chain is unparalleled, whose strategic insights have been instrumental in our own acquisition analysis, and whose vision for the company's future aligns perfectly with ours. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating the new chairman of the board of Sterling Manufacturing, Mr. Thomas Finch. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Every eye in the room swiveled towards me, the quiet, unassuming rock collector at the guest of honor's table. Eleanor squeezed my hand so tightly her knuckles went white, a fierce, triumphant pride shining in her eyes. Beatrice and Cynthia looked as though they had seen a ghost. And Arthur just stared at me, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending, cataclysmic shock. His legacy, his company, his entire world had just been quietly, methodically, and comprehensively acquired by the very man he had, just moments before, so contemptuously dismissed as useless. The geological survey of Arthur Ainsworth's ego had just hit bedrock, and the resulting tremor, I suspected, was about to register a 10 on the family Richter scale. The stunned silence in the ballroom stretched for a long, pregnant moment, a vacuum of disbelief into which the last vestiges of Arthur Ainsworth's carefully constructed world seemed to vanish. Then Julian Croft, a man who clearly relished a bit of well-executed corporate theater, began to applaud, his sharp, decisive claps echoing in the cavernous room. A few of his associates, scattered amongst the tables, quickly joined in, followed by a hesitant, then more confident, ripple of applause from the rest of the guests, who, while clearly bewildered, understood one thing with absolute clarity. A major and entirely unexpected power shift had just occurred. I rose slowly from my seat, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod to Julian at the podium. My gaze then fell upon my father-in-law. Arthur was still staring at me, his face a ghastly shade of pale, his earlier magnanimous pride replaced by a look of stark, unadulterated horror. He looked like a man who had just witnessed his own meticulously crafted oil portrait spontaneously combust. Eleanor, beside me, was a study in quiet, triumphant composure, though her eyes shone with an emotion so fierce it almost took my breath away. Beatrice had her hand to her throat, her pearl necklace suddenly seeming to constrict her breathing. Cynthia and Gerald, across the table, looked as though they had simultaneously bitten into a particularly sour lemon. I walked to the podium, the applause swelling around me, a surreal soundtrack to the most profound and ironic moment of my life. I shook Julian Croft's hand. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I am honored by the board's confidence in me, and I look forward to working with you to guide Sterling Manufacturing into a new era of innovation and prosperity." I then turned to face the assembled guests, my gaze sweeping over the sea of shocked, curious, and in some cases, openly hostile faces before finally coming to rest on my father-in-law. I began, my voice resonating with a quiet authority that was entirely my own, like to thank Mr. Arthur Ainsworth for his keynote address. He spoke eloquently of legacy, of history, of the Sterling way. And he is right. Legacy is important, but a true legacy is not a static monument to the past. It is a living, evolving entity, one that must adapt to new realities, embrace new technologies, and be guided by new expertise if it is to survive and thrive in a changing world. I paused, letting my words hang in the air. Sterling Manufacturing's future, I continued, lies not in reminiscing about its past glories, but in aggressively pursuing its future potential. And that potential, as my own particular field of study has made abundantly clear, lies in the strategic management of the very rare and very valuable raw materials that are now the lifeblood of its most innovative products. It is a world of complex supply chains, of geopolitical risk, of spectroscopic analysis, a world, perhaps, that may seem arcane to some. But it is, I assure you, the real world of 21st century manufacturing. The pointed reference to Arthur's earlier condescending remarks was not lost on anyone at our table. As the new chairman, I concluded, my commitment is to honor Sterling's legacy of quality, but also to lead it into a future of unprecedented growth and technological leadership. It will be a challenging journey, one that will require a certain killer instinct, a certain drive and ambition. Qualities, I added, my gaze now fixed directly on Arthur, a small, humorless smile touching my lips, that I have been so recently and so publicly encouraged to cultivate. Thank you. I stepped down from the podium to another, more confident round of applause. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been fundamentally and irrevocably rewritten. The remainder of the evening was a blur of handshakes, of introductions to key Sterling executives, who now looked at me with a new, almost fearful respect, of quiet, urgent consultations with Julian Croft and his team. Arthur, Beatrice, Cynthia, and Gerald remained at their table, a small, isolated island of stunned disbelief in a sea of swirling corporate change. They did not speak to me. They did not even look at me. They simply sat, their overcooked prime rib growing cold on their plates, their world upended. We left before dessert was served. Eleanor and I walked out of the hotel, out into the cool night air, a profound sense of weary but deeply satisfying closure settling over me. The battle, the one I had never sought but had been forced to engage in, was over. And the victory, however ironic, however unexpected, was total. The next day, a Sunday, was quiet. The public announcement of the acquisition and my appointment was scheduled for Monday morning when the financial markets opened. I anticipated a flurry of calls, of reactions, of the inevitable fallout from the previous night's dramatic events. But for now, there was only a peaceful, almost surreal calm. Around noon, the doorbell rang. It was Arthur, alone. He looked diminished. The usual bluff, hearty arrogance was gone, replaced by a kind of weary, hollowed-out resignation. He held a small, rather battered, cardboard box in his hands. "Thomas," he said, his voice hoarse, avoiding my eye. I came to, I thought you might want these." He thrust the box towards me. Inside, nestled on a bed of old tissue paper, were several geological hammers, a set of antique mineral specimen cases, and a worn, leather-bound first edition of Agricola's De Re Metallica, a seminal 16th-century treatise on mining and metallurgy. They were from my late grandfather's collection, heirlooms I'd cherished as a boy, but which had, upon my grandfather's passing, been absorbed into the Ainsworth family estate, and subsequently relegated to a dusty corner of Arthur's attic, deemed, no doubt, part of my useless collection of rocks and things. I was clearing out some old things, Arthur mumbled, still not looking at me. "Thought of you. Thought you should have them." It was, in its own way, a peace offering, a white flag, an unspoken acknowledgement of my world, of my passion, of a value he was only now, and perhaps only dimly, beginning to comprehend. "Thank you, Arthur," I said quietly, taking the box. "That's very thoughtful of you." He nodded, then turned to leave, his shoulders slumped. "Arthur," I called after him. He paused, his back still to me. "Sterling Manufacturing, its legacy, it will be in safe hands," I said. "I'll see to it." He didn't reply. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then walked slowly down the path to his car, a man stripped of his illusions, his borrowed authority, his carefully constructed world. In that moment, I felt not triumph, but a flicker of something akin to pity. He was, I realized, just a man who had built his entire identity on a foundation of perceived status and corporate prestige, a foundation that had just been proven to be as unstable as uncompacted fill. My own foundations, the ones built on knowledge, on expertise, on a quiet, unwavering passion for the hidden wonders of the earth, had in the end proven to be far more solid, far more enduring, and, as it turned out, far more valuable. The rock collector had inherited the earth, or at least a controlling interest in a mid-tier manufacturing firm with a surprisingly robust portfolio of rare earth mineral-dependent technologies. The irony was not lost on me, and I had a feeling that the next Ainsworth family dinner, should one ever occur, would be a very different and considerably more respectful affair. The public announcement of the acquisition of Sterling Manufacturing by Croft Capital Partners and my subsequent and entirely unexpected appointment as chairman of the board sent shockwaves through the local business community. The financial pages were filled with speculation, with analysis, with profiles of Julian Croft, the aggressive private equity titan, and, to my considerable amusement, with rather hastily assembled biographical sketches of me, Thomas Finch, the enigmatic rock collector at the helm of Sterling's new future. The narrative they settled on was one of a brilliant but reclusive expert, a hidden gem, the puns were perhaps inevitable, brought in by Croft to unlock the company's untapped potential in the high-tech materials sector. There was, of course, no mention of the intricate family drama, the years of quiet condescension, the anniversary dinner that had served as the catalyst for this corporate earthquake. That story remained a private, if deeply satisfying, piece of our family's revised historical record. My transition into the role of chairman was both challenging and invigorating. The old guard at Sterling, those who had been loyal to Arthur's nostalgic, backward-looking vision, were initially wary, even hostile. But as I began to implement the new strategic plan, securing long-term, favorable contracts for our critical rare earth mineral supplies, investing heavily in research and development for our advanced motor technologies, streamlining outdated production processes while preserving the core commitment to quality that had always been the company's true strength. Even the most entrenched skeptics began to see the logic and the undeniable financial benefits of the new direction. Sterling Manufacturing, under my and Julian Croft's guidance, began to transform. It became leaner, yes, but also smarter, more innovative, more resilient. Our stock price, once stagnant, began a steady, impressive climb. Our reputation shifted from that of a solid but somewhat staid old-school manufacturer to that of a cutting-edge leader in high-performance materials and technologies. The company, it seemed, was finally living up to its true potential. My relationship with Eleanor's family also underwent a profound, if somewhat awkward, recalibration. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, seemed to adopt a new strategy of almost fearful deference towards me. Her invitations to family gatherings, when they came, were now phrased as hesitant requests rather than royal summons, and her conversation with me was peppered with nervous, almost comical, attempts to show interest in my work. "Thomas, dear," she'd say, her voice a little too bright, "I was just reading a fascinating article about lithium-ion batteries. So complex. It made me think of you and your important minerals." Cynthia and Gerald, my sister-in-law and her husband, the shark, largely avoided me, their earlier smugness replaced by a kind of sullen, resentful silence whenever I was in their presence. Gerald's prospects, it seemed, had not improved, and the contrast between his stagnant career and my own rather spectacular ascent was clearly a source of considerable bitterness for them both. Arthur, however, was the most significant and surprising evolution. Our relationship, once defined by his casual disdain and my quiet endurance, settled into a new, more honest, if still somewhat formal, dynamic. He continued to visit me occasionally, his initial offering of my grandfather's geological tools having opened a door to a new kind of conversation between us. He never explicitly apologized for his past behavior, for the years of dismissiveness, for the useless verdict he had so publicly rendered. But his actions, his quiet curiosity about my work, his grudging but growing respect for my achievements, were an apology of a different and perhaps more meaningful kind. He even, on one occasion, asked for my advice on a small personal investment he was considering, a gesture of deference that, a few years prior, would have been utterly unthinkable. It was during one of these quiet, tentative conversations about a year after I'd taken the helm at Sterling that he finally, in his own gruff, roundabout way, addressed the elephant that had long stood in the room. We were in my study, surrounded by my books, my mineral samples, the quiet evidence of my life's passion. He was looking at a particularly beautiful specimen of tourmaline, its crystalline structure a marvel of natural engineering. "You know, Thomas," he said, not looking at me, his voice low, almost a mumble, "I spent my whole life thinking I understood value. The value of a strong balance sheet, of a good brand, of a solid piece of machinery. I built my career on it, built my identity on it." He paused, still staring at the tourmaline. "But I think I missed a few things. The value of quiet expertise, of specialized knowledge, of seeing the potential in things other people just see as rocks." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes, for the first time, holding not judgment, not condescension, but a flicker of something that looked remarkably like admiration. "You, son," he said, his voice still gruff, but with a new note of something I could only describe as respect. "You see the value in the rocks. You always did. And that's a damned sight more useful, it turns out, than I ever gave you credit for." It was the closest he would ever come to saying he was sorry, to admitting he had been wrong. And for me, it was more than enough. It was a reconciliation, not just of our relationship, but of our two vastly different worlds, a quiet acknowledgement that value, like the rare minerals I so loved, can often be found in the most unexpected of places, hidden deep beneath a surface that reveals little of the true treasures within. The useless rock collector had, at last, been fully and finally appraised, and his worth, it seemed, had been found to be considerable. The years continued to spool out, each one further solidifying the new reality that had been so dramatically established at that long-ago anniversary dinner. Sterling Manufacturing, under my chairmanship and with Julian Croft's aggressive but astute financial backing, became a true global powerhouse, a leader in the specialized field of high-performance electric motor technology, its growth far exceeding even our most optimistic initial projections. The Sterling Way, as my father-in-law had once so proudly proclaimed it, had been preserved in its commitment to quality, but had also been transformed, infused with a new dynamism, a new vision, a new understanding of its place in a rapidly evolving technological landscape. My own life, too, found a new, richer equilibrium. My work at Sterling was demanding but deeply fulfilling, a practical application of my lifelong passion for the hidden wonders of the earth. But I also made sure to carve out time for my own research, for my quiet consultations with museums and academic institutions, for the simple, profound joy of holding a rare, beautiful mineral in my hand and understanding its long, silent journey through deep time. Eleanor, my steadfast, loving wife, was my constant partner in this new, more expansive life. She found her own renewed sense of purpose, using our newfound financial security to establish a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting botanical research and the preservation of endangered plant species, a cause she was deeply passionate about. We traveled the world together, not to the fashionable resorts her sister Cynthia so admired, but to remote, beautiful places, the Amazon rainforest, the Galapagos Islands, the windswept heaths of Scotland, places where the intricate, often overlooked beauty of the natural world was on full display. Our relationship, once tested by the corrosive pressures of her family's disapproval, was now stronger, more resilient, more deeply rooted than ever. The Ainsworth family dynamic, in its own way, also found a new, if somewhat altered, state of balance. Arthur, in his final years, became a surprisingly frequent and welcome visitor to our home. His conversations with me, once so fraught with unspoken judgment, became a source of genuine, if sometimes gruff, connection. He'd bring me articles about new mining technologies, ask for my opinion on the geopolitical implications of resource scarcity, and even, on one memorable occasion, presented me with a small, beautifully preserved fossil he'd found in an estate sale, with a note that simply read, "Thought you'd appreciate the provenance, Thomas." It was his way of acknowledging my world, of finally, truly seeing me. After he passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, Eleanor and I were going through his papers. Tucked away in his old desk, we found a file labeled Sterling T. Finch. Inside, there was a collection of newspaper and magazine articles, meticulously clipped and dated, detailing Sterling Manufacturing's remarkable turnaround under my chairmanship. There were interviews with industry analysts praising the company's new strategic vision, reports on our record-breaking quarterly earnings, even a small, rather blurry, photograph of me receiving an award for corporate leadership. He had never mentioned any of it to me, but he had kept it all, a quiet, private archive of his son-in-law's success, a success he had once so casually and so comprehensively dismissed. Eleanor wept as we looked through it. "He was proud of you, Thomas," she whispered. "So very proud. He never knew how to say it."